Do you hate being stuck inside all day modelling just for things like this to happen? Welcome back to a 3D ROS video. Today I'm going to introduce you to Photogrammetry and give you pointers on how to make assets like these. Firstly, I'll make a quick stop for petrol, then I'll walk you through a few things when we're on location. Now, I do want to note before we start shooting that these weather conditions are not ideal for a motorbike or shooting for photogrammetry. Water leaves surfaces looking glossy, which results in an inaccurate capture as the software gets confused when making tracking points. Despite this, I'll show you what to look out for when shooting and how to clean up undesired results in post. Right, so here we are at the park. I'm now looking for elements we can scan. Those trees are a possibility for the bark, but you wouldn't want to scan something like this bin. 1. It's in the sun, which means harsh contrast. 2. It's reflective. And 3. It's a very simple model, which means it would be easier to just model and texture by hand. It's a beautiful looking day, but unfortunately the sun isn't going to work in our favour when trying to scan our models. So I found these bricks in the forest. I'm going to scan one and see how it goes. Okay, we're back at the PC, and I've organised the photos into folders. Let's check out the photos of that brick that I shot. Okay, here you see I have two folders, one for JPEG and another for RAW images. It's important to shoot in RAW where possible and get the most information from your images. At the bare minimum, you need to keep your ISO and f-stop consistent for each photo of the same object. A low ISO will give a darker but less grainy image, and a low f-stop will give a less blurry image but a darker one. It's important to keep these well balanced for the best image, but the same for a whole image set. You should be able to change these settings even using a fairly modern phone in Pro Photo mode. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to slap the images into Agisoft Metashape and see how they turn out. Once you've imported your scan images, you want to go to Workflow and Align Images. This generates tracking points that images have in common, and from there works out the camera position. Okay, it's now generated some tracking points and aligned the cameras. Unfortunately, we have a warning message. Because some of the photos did not have sufficient overlap or lighting conditions had changed, and so on, it was unable to determine the camera position for a few images. But I'm just going to dismiss that for now. Before we go on to the next step, I just want to point out that there's a fair amount of information missing on the sides. Now, it is expected to see sizable gaps at this stage, however, judging by this build, we need more side photos. Now we have a nice point cloud, we're going to go to Workflow and build a dense cloud. You can go straight to build mesh and use an alternate calculation method. However, building a dense cloud first will give you more detail and accurate data. Once that's done, I'm going to build the mesh using the dense cloud. So again, go to Workflow, Build Mesh. Under Source Data, we want to build using our dense cloud instead of depth maps. If you want a faster, less accurate result, you can use depth maps and skip the dense cloud build, but because I built the dense cloud, I'm going to use that as the source. Once that's finished building, we now have our high poly mesh. As you can see, mainly on one side we have some missing geometry and awful looking colour data. This is because the images I took for this brick were not sufficient in positioning for the software to build correctly. As well as this, the lighting conditions were far from ideal, as we had some direct sunlight and some shade. When shooting, you want to make sure you have relatively even lighting. If shooting outdoors, an overcast, cloudy day is perfect. Although normally I wouldn't want to progress any further with a model like this, as it's beyond cleanup, which I'll show you soon. I'm going to use the square tool to delete part of the mesh, and that way when we build the texture, we have more space for what matters. Now I'm going to build the textures by going to Workflow and Build Texture. As you can see, fortunately, building the texture has removed a lot of problems we were having in regards to dark spots, which is great, but if I was to do this mesh again, especially if it was going to be a larger object, I would take a lot more photos and give them a cleanup like I'm going to show you now. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. You can use other programs, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to use Photoshop Camera Raw as an example. So, if you have the Camera Raw plugin installed, you can do this, and I'm pretty sure the new version of Photoshop comes with it pre-installed anyway, like this one. So if we just go File, Open, and we find our raw images of the object we want, I'm just going to use my dragon as an example for this. So if we go to the raw images, and we select them all, and we'll press Open, because they're in RAW format, they will open in Camera Raw, a Photoshop plugin. So we'll just wait for this to load. Okay, now the photos have loaded, we can see all the photos here. And as you can see, the lighting varies greatly on some of them. So here we can see this one's quite dark, and these are very dark in comparison to the rest, which makes it very hard for the program to determine. So what you want to do is you want to select the ones that are too dark, and we'll literally just increase the highlights until we get something that looks like the rest. But also with every single model, every single photo rather, we don't want them too overexposed or underexposed. So I'm just going to press a photo and Ctrl A to select them all. And here in our graph, in our histogram graph, we can see that we've got a point on the dark end of the blacks. And we want to make this into the center. That way it's not underexposed or overexposed, it's quite even. So, because the blacks, we can adjust the darks and we can see how this affects the graph. So I'm just going to move that to the right. The highlights are okay, so we don't need to change that. We'll just move the shadows further along this way. And we can also go up and use this curve graph to slowly start trying to edit the position. And it's okay to have a point in the middle for the exposure, but we don't want it on either end. It's okay to have it in the middle because we still want some contrast to differentiate between the different areas of the model. As you can see, some are way too overexposed, so you just kind of have to go into the individual ones that are overexposed, click the first one, you can shift click them individually, or you can just shift click the final one and it'll select them all in between. And we just want to see it bring the highlights down for this one, because as you can see, it's quite high on the whites. And you'd also get the graph, and you just click that part and move it to the left. And then once you're done with editing, you can go up to the save icon here, And if we press that, we'll get some options. And if you just save it normally, it'll overwrite it. But if you press select folder, and I usually create a folder called edited, and I press select, so that folder's selected, and then I press save and done, and that'll save our photos into that folder. Now the difference between edited photos and not edited photos can be huge. So an example of this is my original dragon piece looked like this. So this was with the photos not edited and on medium settings. And as you can see, it didn't piece them together very well at all. It had problems aligning the photos, and as you can see, it's cutting incorrectly here. But then I went in and edited some of the photos in camera raw. So if I just open up the improved version, and as you can see, although there's a bit more surface noise, it has completely fixed the back area. And although some of it's in shade, it has managed to align the photos correctly. And the thing with the shade is we can go into Photoshop later once the model's UV'd, and we can adjust the levels for specific areas. But as long as the mesh is lined up, we've got a great base mesh to work off of. Okay, so that pretty much concludes this video. In summary, shoot in RAW with a constant ISO and f-stop. Avoid shadows and direct light. Avoid simple and shiny surfaces. Avoid objects that have a small amount of identifiable points. Edit your photo levels when needed. Delete photos that may cause calculation problems. Take plenty of photos with enough overlap. And most importantly, have fun and experiment. In my next Photogrammetry video, I will show you how we can optimize our mesh, reducing the poly count for real-time rendering and applying better UVs. In the meantime, you've watched this far, so you're legally obliged to like and subscribe. And check out the end card for a video you'll love. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.